The morning sun
We
cast
must
long
address
shadows
this matter
across
with
the
the
marble
utmost
floors of Raven's
urgency.
Hollow
I agree,
Palace.
but we must
But
proceed with caution.
inside the private dining room, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. King Alexander sat at the head of the mahogany table, his weathered hands gripping his morning tea cup with unusual tension. At 68, he had weathered many storms during his reign, but nothing quite like the growing conflict between the two most important women in his life. Queen Vivian, his second wife of 15 years, sat to his right, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the newspaper spread before her. Her perfectly styled auburn hair caught the light as she shook her head in obvious displeasure. Across from her, Princess Elena, Alexander's daughter-in-law, and the wife of Crown Prince Marcus, maintained her composure while buttering her toast, though those who knew her well could see the slight tremor in her hands. The tension had been building for months now, ever since Elena had begun taking on more prominent royal duties. What had started as subtle disagreements about protocol had escalated into something far more serious. Vivian, who had fought hard to establish her position as queen after Alexander's controversial divorce from his first wife, saw Elena's rising popularity as a direct threat to her own influence. "I see the newspapers are calling you the people's princess again," Vivian said, her voice carrying a tone that could freeze champagne. She didn't look up from her paper as she spoke, but Elena could feel the weight of her displeasure. Elena set down her knife carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters. "I'm simply doing my duty, Your Majesty. The charity work and public appearances are part of my role as the future queen consort." "Your role," Vivian repeated slowly, finally, raising her eyes to meet Elena's. "How interesting that you seem to have such a clear understanding of what that entails. Perhaps you could enlighten the rest of us about these duties you've assigned yourself." King Alexander cleared his throat, recognizing the warning signs of another confrontation. "Vivian, please. Elena has been doing excellent work with the children's literacy program. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive." "Oh, I'm sure it has," Vivian replied, her smile sharp as cut glass. "The question is whether seeking such popularity is appropriate for someone in her position. After all, we must remember that the crown serves the people, not the other way around." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Elena felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. She had faced worse than Vivian's subtle barbs before, though never quite so directly in front of the king himself. "I would never presume to put personal gain above the welfare of the monarchy," Elena said quietly. "Everything I do is in service to the crown and to our future subjects." Vivian's laugh was like the tinkling of broken crystal. "How noble. And I suppose your recent decision to add 3 more charity patronages to your schedule was also purely in service to the crown? Not perhaps an attempt to outshine those who have been serving much longer?" The accusation was clear now, and Elena felt her carefully maintained calm beginning to fray. She glanced at King Alexander, hoping he would intervene more forcefully, but saw only the tired resignation of a man caught between competing loyalties. "I accepted those patronages because they needed support," Elena replied, her voice slightly stronger now. "The organizations had been without royal patronage for nearly 2 years. I thought it would be beneficial." "You thought," Vivian interrupted, setting her teacup down with enough force to make it ring against the saucer. "How presumptuous. I wasn't aware that thinking for the royal family had become part of your duties as well." The dining room fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Even the usual sounds of palace life seemed muted, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Elena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to remain seated, to maintain the dignity that had been drilled into her since the day she had married into this family. King Alexander finally spoke, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Perhaps we could discuss this later, when emotions aren't running quite so high." "Emotions?" Vivian's eyebrows arched elegantly. "I'm simply concerned about maintaining proper protocol and hierarchy within this family. If that's emotional, then perhaps our standards have slipped more than I realized." Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "If you'll excuse me, Your Majesties, I have a literacy center to visit this morning. I wouldn't want to keep the children waiting." As she turned to leave, Vivian's voice followed her like a whip crack. "Yes, do run along to your little photo opportunities. I'm sure the photographers are eagerly waiting to capture your next moment of manufactured compassion." Elena stopped in the doorway, her hand gripping the ornate handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. For a moment, the room balanced on the edge of explosion. She could feel 25 years of royal training warring with the very human desire to turn around and defend herself properly. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke without turning around. "I hope you have a pleasant day, Your Majesty." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving King Alexander alone with his seething wife. He looked at Vivian with a mixture of disappointment and concern that made her defensive posture falter slightly. "Was that really necessary?" he asked quietly. Vivian's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something vulnerable beneath the polished exterior. "She needs to understand her place, Alexander. I've worked too hard to build the respect and authority of this crown to watch it be undermined by a girl who thinks popularity is more important than protocol." "Elena isn't trying to undermine anyone," Alexander replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure what Elena was trying to do. Her popularity had indeed grown exponentially in recent months, and while that was generally good for the monarchy, it had created unexpected tensions within the family. "Isn't she?" Vivian challenged. "Then, why does every newspaper article about her mention how refreshing and modern she is?" "The implication is quite clear. She represents the new guard, while the rest of us are relics of a bygone era." Alexander couldn't deny that the media comparisons had been particularly pointed lately. Elena's natural warmth and ease with the public stood in stark contrast to the more formal approach that he and Vivian had maintained throughout their reign. It wasn't Elena's fault that she possessed qualities that resonated with a changing world, but he could understand his wife's frustration. "The monarchy has always had to evolve," he said carefully. "Perhaps Elena's approach is simply what this generation needs to see from us." Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously. "And what about what I need, Alexander? I've stood beside you for 15 years, defending this crown against scandal and criticism. I've rebuilt the respect that was lost during your divorce, and I've never once sought personal glory or popularity for its own sake. Now I'm supposed to step aside gracefully while your son's wife claims the spotlight I've earned." The pain in her voice was real, and Alexander felt a familiar stab of guilt. Vivian had indeed sacrificed much for their marriage and his crown. She had endured years of public skepticism and comparison to his beloved first wife, Queen Isabella. She had worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of her position, only to find herself facing a new challenge in the form of a daughter-in-law who seemed to effortlessly command the affection that Vivian had fought so hard to earn. "No one is asking you to step aside," Alexander said, reaching across to touch her hand. "You're my queen, Vivian. That will never change." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew that the dynamics of the royal family were shifting. Elena's star was rising, and with it came inevitable questions about the future of the monarchy. The press had already begun speculating about when Crown Prince Marcus might take a more prominent role, and, by extension, when Elena might assume many of the duties currently held by Queen Vivian. Meanwhile, Elena made her way through the palace corridors with measured steps, acknowledging the respectful nods of staff members while fighting to maintain her composure. The encounter with Vivian had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She had known that her growing public profile might create tensions, but she hadn't anticipated the depth of Vivian's resentment. As she entered her private office, Elena found her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, waiting with a concerned expression. Margaret had served the royal family for nearly 30 years and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble brewing within the palace walls. "Difficult morning, Your Royal Highness?" Margaret asked gently, moving to close the office door behind them. Elena sank into her chair and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "I'm beginning to wonder if I'm handling this situation correctly, Margaret. Queen Vivian seems to view everything I do as a personal challenge to her authority." Margaret, who had witnessed similar dynamics during the tumultuous years of King Alexander's first marriage, chose her words carefully. "The transition of roles within any family can be challenging, ma'am. Perhaps especially so when those roles carry such public significance. But I'm not trying to take anything away from her," Elena protested. "I'm simply trying to fulfill my obligations as the future queen consort. The people seem to respond positively to the work I'm doing, and I thought that was beneficial for the monarchy as a whole." "It is beneficial," Margaret assured her. "Your approval ratings are the highest we've seen for any royal family member in over a decade. The question is how to manage that success in a way that doesn't create division within the family." Elena stared out the window at the palace gardens, where tourists were already gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Those people out there had no idea of the complex dynamics and careful balance required to maintain the institution they came to observe and admire. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if Marcus hadn't been a prince, she said quietly. If we could have just been a normal couple, dealing with ordinary problems. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. But then, you wouldn't have the platform to make the difference you're making, ma'am. The literacy program alone has already helped thousands of children. That's not something everyone gets the opportunity to accomplish. It was true, Elena reflected. Despite the personal cost, her position did allow her to champion causes that were important to her and to make a real impact on people's lives. The question was whether that was worth the growing rift within the royal family. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Margaret opened it to reveal Crown Prince Marcus, Elena's husband of 7 years. His tall frame filled the doorway, and even in his casual morning attire, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone born to rule. "Good morning, darling," he said, crossing to kiss Elena's cheek. "I heard there was some tension at breakfast this morning." Elena looked up at her husband with tired eyes. "News travels fast in the palace." "It always has," Marcus replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Are you all right?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid Elena's careful composure. Marcus had always been her anchor in the sometimes treacherous waters of royal life. But, lately, she had been hesitant to burden him with the growing conflict between her and his stepmother. "I'm managing," she said, though they both knew it wasn't really an answer. Marcus studied her face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of palace politics from childhood. "Vivian is feeling threatened by your success. Father mentioned it to me last week." Elena's eyes widened slightly. "He did? What did he say?" "That he's caught in an impossible situation," Marcus replied honestly. "He loves Vivian and wants to support her, but he also recognizes that you represent the future of the monarchy. The public adores you, Elena. That's both a blessing and a complication." "I never asked for adoration," Elena said with some frustration. "I just wanted to do my job well." "I know that," Marcus said, reaching across to take her hand. "And Father knows that too. But Vivian sees every article praising your work, every comparison between your approach and hers, and she feels like she's being pushed aside." Elena sank back in her chair, feeling the weight of the situation settling around her like a heavy cloak. "So what am I supposed to do? Stop doing charity work? Deliberately perform poorly in public? That hardly seems like it would serve the crown any better." "No, of course not," Marcus said quickly. "But perhaps we need to find ways to show that your success doesn't diminish Vivian's contributions. She's been a stabilizing force for Father and for the monarchy. Her work might not generate the same media attention as yours, but it's been equally important." The suggestion was reasonable, but Elena couldn't help feeling frustrated by the implication that she should somehow manage another woman's insecurities about her own success. Still, she understood that the harmony of the royal family was more important than any individual ego, including her own. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his options carefully. "Perhaps you could find opportunities to publicly acknowledge Vivian's guidance and experience. Show deference to her position as queen while continuing your own work." It was a diplomatic solution, but Elena wondered privately whether any gesture would be enough to satisfy Vivian's apparent need for supremacy. The encounter at breakfast had revealed a depth of resentment that suggested this conflict ran deeper than simple professional rivalry. "I'll try," Elena said finally. "But, Marcus, I need you to understand that I won't compromise the work I'm doing. These causes are too important, and the people depending on our support deserve better than half-hearted effort because of family politics." Marcus's expression showed both admiration and concern. It was one of the things he loved most about Elena, her genuine commitment to service, but it was also what made this situation so delicate. Elena's integrity made it impossible for her to simply step back or diminish her efforts to appease Vivian. "I wouldn't ask you to compromise your principles," he said. "We'll find a way to make this work. We have to." As Elena prepared for her public appearance at the Literacy Center, she couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's confrontation had marked a turning point. The careful balance that had maintained relative peace within the royal family was beginning to crack, and she wasn't sure that diplomatic gestures would be enough to repair the damage. The truth was that two strong women with different visions for the monarchy were now operating within the same sphere of influence, and something would eventually have to give. Elena only hoped that when that moment came, the institution they all claimed to serve wouldn't be irreparably damaged in the process. The sound of her car arriving in the palace courtyard signaled that it was time to put on her public face and focus on the work that had brought her into this conflict in the first place. As she gathered her things, Elena reflected on the irony that her success in serving the people might ultimately threaten the very institution that made that service possible. But, for now, there were children waiting to meet her, teachers hoping for royal support of their programs, and photographers ready to capture moments that would either strengthen or further complicate her position within the royal family. Elena straightened her shoulders, checked her appearance one final time, and prepared to step back into the public eye, carrying with her the weight of both opportunity and consequence that defined her life as a future queen. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at breakfast, and the tension within Ravenshollow Palace had only intensified. What had once been subtle undercurrents of rivalry had evolved into something more dangerous, a carefully orchestrated campaign by Queen Vivian to reassert her dominance over the royal family's public image. The first sign of escalation came during the weekly planning meeting for royal engagements. Elena sat in the ornate conference room alongside other senior members of the royal household, reviewing the upcoming calendar of events. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, the palace's communications director, was presenting the proposed schedule when Queen Vivian made her entrance. "I apologize for the delay," Vivian announced, though her tone suggested anything but regret. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that emphasized her authority, and her entrance commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "I've been reviewing some concerning matters that require immediate attention." Elena felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Over the past weeks, she had learned to recognize the particular tone Vivian used when she was preparing to assert her position. Today, that tone carried an edge that suggested something significant was about to happen. "Please, continue with the presentation," Vivian said to Sir Geoffrey, settling into her chair at the head of the table, a position that technically should have been left for King Alexander, though he rarely attended these operational meetings. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat nervously and continued outlining the proposed events. "Next month, we have the opening of the new wing at St. Mary's Children's Hospital, which we had planned for Princess Elena to attend, given her work with children's charities." "Actually," Vivian interrupted smoothly, "I think that would be more appropriate for me to handle. As queen, I should be taking the lead on major institutional openings. We wouldn't want to send the wrong message about hierarchy within the royal family." The room fell silent. Elena felt every eye in the room shift between her and Vivian, waiting to see how this power play would unfold. The hospital opening was something Elena had been working toward for months, collaborating with the administrators to develop programs that would extend beyond the ceremonial ribbon cutting. "Of course, Your Majesty," Elena said carefully. "Though I should mention that I've been working closely with the hospital's child psychology department to develop some ongoing support programs. Perhaps we could coordinate our efforts." Vivian's smile was perfectly polished and completely cold. "How thoughtful of you to have taken such initiative. However, I think a clean handover would be most appropriate. We wouldn't want to confuse the public with too many royal presences at one event." Elena bit back her first response, recognizing that any show of resistance would only escalate the situation. But she also knew that stepping back from the hospital opening would mean abandoning months of carefully planned programming that could genuinely benefit the children receiving treatment there. "I understand your position," Elena said slowly. "But the hospital staff have prepared some specific presentations about the new children's programs, and I've promised to review their proposals for royal patronage. Perhaps I could attend in a supporting role." The suggestion was reasonable, but Elena could see immediately that Vivian had no intention of accepting any compromise that would allow Elena to share the spotlight. "I appreciate your dedication," Vivian replied, "but I think it's important that we maintain clear lines of responsibility. I will handle the hospital opening, and you can certainly continue your excellent work with the smaller literacy programs. After all, everyone should work within their appropriate sphere of influence." The message was unmistakable. Vivian was systematically claiming the most prominent royal duties for herself, relegating Elena to less significant events. Elena glanced around the room and saw the uncomfortable expressions of staff members who understood exactly what they were witnessing. Sir Geoffrey attempted to move the meeting forward by presenting the next item on the agenda, a state dinner for visiting dignitaries from the Commonwealth nations. This, surely, would be something that required both the Queen and the Crown Prince's wife to participate. "The Commonwealth dinner will require extensive planning," Sir Geoffrey said, consulting his notes. "We'll need both Your Majesty and Princess Elena to attend, given the significance of the relationships involved. Naturally, Vivian agreed, though I think it would be wise for me to take the lead on all diplomatic aspects of the evening. Elena, perhaps you could focus on the more social elements, ensuring the guests are comfortable, managing the lighter conversation. Your natural warmth would be perfect for that supporting role. Again, Elena found herself being politely but firmly pushed into a subordinate position. The Commonwealth dinner was exactly the kind of event where her genuine interest in international relations and development work could be showcased, but Vivian was ensuring that she would be relegated to hostess duties. I'd be happy to help with hospitality, Elena said, maintaining her composure despite growing frustration. Though I should mention that the High Commissioner from Zambia specifically requested to discuss the education initiative I've been supporting in their northern provinces. Vivian's expression flickered with annoyance at this information. Elena's international work had been gaining recognition beyond Britain's borders, something that clearly irritated the Queen. I'm sure he'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss education policy with the appropriate ministers, Vivian said dismissively. Royal dinners are about building relationships, not conducting detailed policy discussions. Elena felt her patience beginning to fray. Vivian was systematically undermining her role and expertise while disguising it as appropriate protocol. Worse, she was doing it in front of the entire household staff, ensuring that Elena's diminished status would be clearly understood throughout the palace. With respect, Your Majesty, Elena said, her voice slightly sharper than before. I've been working on international education initiatives for 3 years. I think I'm qualified to discuss policy matters with Commonwealth representatives. The room's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Elena had just challenged Vivian's authority more directly than anyone had expected, and the staff members present seemed to collectively hold their breath. Vivian's smile remained perfectly in place, but her eyes turned glacial. Of course you're qualified, dear. But qualification and appropriate protocol are two different things. I'm sure you understand the importance of presenting a unified royal presence, particularly when dealing with international relationships. The condescending "dear" hit its mark, and Elena felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks. Vivian was not only dismissing her expertise but doing so in a way that made Elena appear naive and overeager in front of the senior staff. I understand protocol very well, Elena replied, her voice carefully controlled. I also understand that the monarchy's relevance depends on our ability to engage meaningfully with the issues that matter to our people and our international partners. It was a subtle but pointed criticism of Vivian's more formal, traditional approach to royal duties. Elena was suggesting that rigid adherence to hierarchy might actually be detrimental to the monarchy's effectiveness in a changing world. Vivian's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of genuine anger before she regained her composure. How interesting that you feel qualified to lecture us about the monarchy's relevance. Perhaps your perspective would benefit from a deeper understanding of the institution's history and traditions. The insult was delivered with surgical precision. Vivian was suggesting that Elena, despite 7 years in the royal family, remained an outsider who didn't truly understand the institution she had married into. Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. If you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make regarding my current commitments. I'll await your final decisions about the calendar changes. She left the room without waiting for permission to be dismissed, a breach of protocol that sent a clear message about her state of mind. As the door closed behind her, Elena could hear the uncomfortable silence she had left in her wake. In the hallway, Elena's composure finally cracked. She leaned against the marble wall, taking deep breaths and fighting back tears of frustration. Margaret appeared almost immediately, having waited outside the meeting room with the instinctive understanding of someone who had served the royal family through numerous crises. Perhaps we should return to your office, ma'am, Margaret suggested gently, offering Elena a steadying arm. Elena nodded gratefully and allowed herself to be guided back to the privacy of her personal quarters. Once behind closed doors, she sank into her favorite armchair and allowed the full weight of the situation to settle over her. She's trying to destroy everything I've built, Elena said quietly, staring out at the palace gardens where she had once found peace. Every project, every relationship, every initiative, she's systematically taking it all away. Margaret poured Elena a cup of tea with the practiced efficiency of someone who had comforted distressed royals many times before. Queen Vivian is certainly asserting her authority, she agreed carefully. But your work has created relationships that extend beyond any single event or ceremony. Does it matter if I'm not allowed to maintain those relationships? Elena asked with bitter frustration. She's positioning me as a social hostess while claiming all the substantive work for herself. How long before the organizations I've been supporting start to see me as irrelevant? It was a legitimate concern. Elena's effectiveness as a royal patron depended largely on her ability to maintain consistent engagement with the causes she supported. If Vivian succeeded in limiting her to ceremonial roles, the meaningful work Elena had built over several years would inevitably suffer. Perhaps it's time to speak with Prince Marcus, Margaret suggested. She said it was urgent. Elena exchanged a look with Margaret, both wondering what had prompted this sudden summons. Elena had barely had time to process the morning's meeting, and she couldn't imagine what new crisis required urgent attention. Did she provide any indication of what this concerns? Elena asked. No, ma'am. She simply said it was a matter that couldn't wait. Elena rose from her chair with a sense of foreboding. Whatever Vivian wanted to discuss, the timing suggested it was related to Elena's departure from the planning meeting. She had challenged Vivian's authority in front of the staff, and now there would likely be consequences. Very well, Elena said, smoothing her skirt and checking her appearance in the mirror. Please inform Her Majesty that I'll be there shortly. As Elena made her way through the palace corridors toward Vivian's private office, she tried to prepare herself for whatever confrontation awaited. The Queen's office was in the oldest part of the palace, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs and filled with furniture that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. The door to Vivian's office was opened by her private secretary, who gestured Elena inside with a formal courtesy that seemed more strained than usual. Vivian was seated behind her antique desk, surrounded by documents and photographs that emphasized the weight of her position. Elena, thank you for coming so quickly, Vivian said, though her tone suggested this was more command than request. Please sit down. We have some important matters to discuss. Elena took the offered chair, noting that Vivian had arranged the seating to emphasize the power dynamic between them. The Queen remained behind her imposing desk, while Elena sat in a smaller chair that forced her to look up slightly. I've been thinking about our conversation in the planning meeting, Vivian began, and I realized that we may have been talking past each other. I want to make sure we have a clear understanding going forward. Elena waited, knowing that whatever was coming would be presented as reasonable discussion while actually being something quite different. The truth is, Vivian continued, that I've been concerned for some time about the mixed messages the royal family has been sending to the public. When multiple family members take on similar roles or speak about the same issues, it can create confusion about our priorities and authority. I'm not sure I understand what mixed messages you're referring to, Elena said carefully. Vivian smiled with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Well, for example, when you give speeches about education policy or international development, it can appear as though you're speaking for the crown on these matters. But, of course, that's not appropriate. Only the monarch and his designated representatives should be making statements about policy. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Vivian was suggesting that Elena's substantive work was inappropriate, that she should limit herself to ceremonial appearances without addressing the issues that mattered to the organization she supported. I've always been careful to speak about my personal commitment to these causes, not to make policy statements on behalf of the crown, Elena replied. My speeches are reviewed by the communications office to ensure they're appropriate. Yes, but perception is often more important than intention, Vivian said smoothly. When the future queen speaks passionately about education or healthcare, people naturally assume she's reflecting the official position of the royal family. That puts tremendous pressure on the actual decision-makers, the king and his ministers. Elena began to understand the trap that was being set. Vivian was arguing that Elena's effectiveness as a royal patron was actually a problem, that her ability to command attention and inspire support was somehow inappropriate for someone in her position. Are you suggesting that I should stop supporting these causes? Elena asked directly. Not at all, Vivian replied quickly. I'm suggesting that you should support them in ways that are more appropriate to your current position in the family hierarchy. Ceremonial appearances, charity galas, photo opportunities. These are all valuable contributions that don't risk overstepping constitutional boundaries. The message was clear. Elena should become a decorative figurehead, lending her presence to events without engaging substantively with the work itself. It was exactly the kind of role that would gradually erode her credibility and influence, leaving her dependent on Vivian's approval for any meaningful activity. I appreciate your concern about constitutional propriety, Elena said, choosing her words very carefully. But I should point out that my current approach has been developed in consultation with the king's private secretary and the constitutional experts on staff. If there were genuine concerns about overreach, I would have expected them to raise those issues directly. It was a subtle challenge, suggesting that Vivian's concerns might not be shared by the constitutional authorities who actually governed royal protocol. Elena was implying that this conversation was about personal control rather than legitimate institutional concerns. Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously, and, for a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped entirely. I think you'll find that I have a rather more comprehensive understanding of constitutional matters than you might assume. I've been queen for 15 years, and I've navigated challenges that you can't even imagine. The mask was off now, and Elena could see the raw anger and resentment that had been building beneath Vivian's polished exterior. This wasn't about protocol or constitutional concerns. It was about a woman who felt her position and authority being undermined by someone younger, more popular, and more naturally suited to the demands of modern royal life. I'm sure you have, Elena replied quietly, and I've always respected your experience and guidance. But I won't apologize for trying to serve effectively in my role as the future queen consort. Vivian stood abruptly, her chair rolling back with enough force to hit the bookshelf behind her. Your role is what I say it is until you actually become queen. And that may be much longer than you seem to think. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Vivian was suggesting that she had the power to influence when, or whether, Elena would ever truly ascend to her position as queen. It was a dangerous game, one that could ultimately damage the monarchy itself, but Elena realized that Vivian was past caring about anything beyond her own need to maintain supremacy. Elena stood as well, recognizing that this conversation had moved beyond any possibility of reasonable resolution. I think we should perhaps continue this discussion when we've both had time to consider what's truly in the best interests of the crown. Oh, I know exactly what's in the best interests of the crown, Vivian said coldly. The question is whether you're willing to accept it. Elena left Vivian's office with the clear understanding that the conflict between them had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine not just their personal relationship, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. And Elena was no longer sure that diplomacy and deference would be enough to protect the work she had spent years building. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Marcus's private study as he stared at the documents spread across his mahogany desk. Reports from the palace communications office painted a troubling picture. Media speculation about tension within the royal family was increasing, and several major newspapers had begun running articles analyzing the different approaches of Queen Vivian and Princess Elena. Marcus had hoped the conflict between his wife and stepmother would resolve itself through private discussion and diplomatic compromise. Instead, it had begun to spill into the public sphere in ways that threatened the carefully maintained image of royal unity. The morning's newspapers included 3 separate articles questioning the future direction of the monarchy, with thinly veiled references to a power struggle within the palace. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Elena entered without waiting for permission, her face pale and her usual composure visibly strained. She had clearly been crying, though she had done her best to repair the damage before seeking him out. "We need to talk," she said simply, closing the door behind her and engaging the privacy lock that would ensure their conversation remained confidential. Marcus set aside the newspapers and focused entirely on his wife. Over their 7 years of marriage, he had learned to read the subtle signs of Elena's emotional state, and what he saw now alarmed him more than he cared to admit. "What's happened?" he asked, rising to meet her in the sitting area where they could speak more informally. Elena sank into the leather armchair that had become her preferred spot during their private conversations. For a moment, she seemed unable to find the words to begin, and Marcus waited patiently while she gathered her composure. "Your stepmother has declared war," Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't think there's any way to avoid being drawn into battle." Marcus had feared this moment would come, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hit him like a physical blow. "Tell me exactly what happened." Elena recounted the events of the past few days, the systematic removal of her most meaningful royal duties, the public humiliation during staff meetings, and, finally, the confrontation in Vivian's office where the Queen had made it clear that she considered Elena's growing influence an existential threat to her own position. "She's not just trying to limit my role," Elena explained. "She's trying to destroy my credibility entirely. Every project I've built, every relationship I've cultivated, every initiative I've started, she's finding ways to undermine them while positioning herself as the sole authority on royal priorities. Marcus listened with growing concern, recognizing patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of the conflicts that had ultimately destroyed his parents' marriage. The same dynamics of competing influence, public perception, and institutional control were playing out again, but this time with even higher stakes. "What did you say to her in response?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I told her I wouldn't apologize for trying to serve effectively in my role," Elena replied. "And she made it very clear that she considers my role to be whatever she decides it should be." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Elena recognized as his response to seemingly impossible situations. As Crown Prince, he had spent his entire life preparing to balance competing interests and find diplomatic solutions to palace conflicts. But this situation seemed to offer no path forward that wouldn't result in significant damage to either his marriage or the monarchy itself. "Elena, I need you to understand something," Marcus said carefully. "Vivian isn't just protecting her own ego or position. She genuinely believes that the monarchy's stability depends on clear hierarchy and traditional protocol. From her perspective, your popularity and media attention represent a threat to the institutional order that has served the crown for centuries." Elena looked at her husband with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Are you defending her?" "I'm trying to help you understand why this conflict has become so intractable," Marcus replied. "Vivian sees every article praising your modern approach, or natural warmth, as an implicit criticism of her more formal style. She's interpreting your success as evidence that the public prefers you to her, and that terrifies her." "Maybe the public does prefer my approach," Elena said with a flash of anger. "Maybe the monarchy needs to evolve beyond rigid formality and empty ceremony. Maybe people want to see their royal family engaging meaningfully with the issues that affect their lives." Marcus could hear the frustration and hurt in Elena's voice, but he also recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. Elena was essentially arguing that her vision for the monarchy was superior to Vivian's, and that the Queen's approach was outdated and irrelevant. "You may be right," Marcus said quietly, "but saying that aloud, especially to Vivian herself, is tantamount to declaring that she should step aside and allow you to lead. That's not a conversation she's prepared to have." Elena stood and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked palace grounds. "So what am I supposed to do, Marcus? Accept that my role is to smile prettily and attend ribbon cuttings while abandoning everything meaningful I've tried to accomplish? Watch years of work with vulnerable children and international development programs crumble because it threatens your stepmother's sense of authority?" The anguish in Elena's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus felt torn between his loyalty to his wife and his understanding of the impossible position his father faced. King Alexander was caught between two strong women with fundamentally different visions for the monarchy, and any decision he made would inevitably damage one of the most important relationships in his life. "There has to be a middle path," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "Some way to preserve both your meaningful work and the institutional stability that Vivian represents." Elena turned from the window, her eyes reflecting a hardness that Marcus had never seen before. "I don't think Vivian is interested in finding a middle path. I think she wants complete capitulation, and she's prepared to destroy me if I don't provide it." Before Marcus could respond, there was an urgent knock on the study door. Marcus opened it to find Sir Geoffrey looking unusually agitated, holding what appeared to be an advance copy of the next day's newspaper. "Your Royal Highness, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but we have a significant problem," Sir Geoffrey said, glancing nervously between Marcus and Elena. "The Telegraph is running a front-page story tomorrow about tensions within the royal family." Marcus took the newspaper and scanned the headline with growing alarm. "Palace power struggle. Queen and future queen in battle for royal authority." The article, while carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, painted a detailed picture of the growing conflict between Vivian and Elena, complete with quotes from unnamed palace sources and analysis of recent changes in royal schedules. Elena read over Marcus's shoulder, her face growing pale as she absorbed the implications of the story. Someone within the palace had been talking to reporters, providing inside information about private family dynamics that were never supposed to become public knowledge. How did they get this level of detail? Elena asked, her voice barely controlled. Sir Geoffrey's expression was grim. The information appears to be coming from multiple sources within the household staff. The changes in your schedule, the tension during meetings, even some details about private conversations. It's all there. Marcus felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. A leak of this magnitude suggested that the palace staff were choosing sides in the conflict between Vivian and Elena. The institution that was supposed to maintain neutrality and protect the royal family's privacy had become a battleground where competing loyalties were leading to devastating breaches of confidence. "Have you spoken to my father about this?" Marcus asked. "His Majesty is reviewing the article now," Sir Geoffrey replied. "He's requested an immediate meeting with both Queen Vivian and Princess Elena to discuss damage control." Elena sank back into her chair, looking suddenly fragile despite the strength she had shown throughout the conflict. "This is exactly what she wanted," Elena said quietly. "Public speculation about my role and authority. Now she can position herself as the stabilizing force who needs to restore order to a chaotic situation." Marcus realized that Elena was probably right. Whether Vivian had deliberately orchestrated the leak or simply benefited from the divided loyalties it represented, the Queen was now in a position to argue that Elena's presence was causing dangerous instability within the royal household. "We need to prepare for that meeting carefully," Marcus said. "Father is going to be looking for solutions that protect the monarchy's reputation while resolving this conflict internally." "What kind of solutions?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Marcus hesitated, knowing that his response would likely determine the future course of his marriage and his wife's role within the royal family. "He may ask one of you to step back from public duties temporarily while we work out a longer-term arrangement." Elena's eyes flashed with anger and hurt. "And which one of us do you think he'll ask to step back, Marcus? The Queen who's been by his side for 15 years, or the daughter-in-law who's become a liability because she's too effective at her job?" The question hung in the air between them like a sword. Marcus knew that his father would likely ask Elena to reduce her public profile, at least temporarily. It would be positioned as a diplomatic solution that allowed both women to maintain their dignity while reducing public speculation about conflict within the family. "Elena, if father asks you to step back, it wouldn't be permanent," Marcus said, trying to find words that might soften the blow he could see coming. "It would just be long enough for the media attention to die down and for us to find a way forward that works for everyone." Elena stared at her husband with an expression that combined disbelief, hurt, and bitter understanding. "You want me to accept exile because my success has become inconvenient for your family?" "That's not what I'm saying," Marcus protested, though they both knew that was exactly what he was saying. "I'm trying to find a way to preserve your work and your position while dealing with the political reality we're facing." Elena stood slowly, her movements careful and controlled in the way that Marcus had learned meant she was fighting to maintain her composure. "The political reality we're facing is that your stepmother has decided I'm a threat, and your family is prepared to sacrifice my work and my integrity to appease her." "Elena, please." "No," Elena interrupted, her voice steady but final. "I understand the situation perfectly now. I've spent 7 years trying to serve this institution with honor and effectiveness, and the reward is being told that my success is the problem." She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to face Marcus. "I'll attend the meeting with your father, and I'll listen to whatever solution he proposes. But I want you to understand that if I'm forced to choose between abandoning everything I've worked for and finding another way forward, I will choose to preserve my integrity and my work." The implicit threat was clear, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest as he realized how close he was to losing the woman he loved to an institution that was supposed to serve the greater good but had become trapped in its own internal contradictions. Elena left the study without another word, leaving Marcus alone with Sir Geoffrey and the newspaper that would tomorrow morning transform their private family conflict into a public spectacle. As he stared at the headline that would reshape their lives, Marcus wondered if there was any way to save both his marriage and the monarchy he had been born to inherit. The rain continued to drum against the windows, and for the first time in his life, Crown Prince Marcus began to question whether the institution he had dedicated his entire existence to serving was worth the price it was demanding from the people he loved most. Meanwhile, in her private chambers, Queen Vivian read the same newspaper article with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The story would indeed position her as the experienced leader who could restore stability to a chaotic situation, but it would also intensify public scrutiny of the royal family at a time when they could least afford additional controversy. She had not directly orchestrated the leak, But she had certainly done nothing to prevent the divided loyalties within the household staff that had made such detailed reporting possible. Now she would need to navigate the aftermath carefully, ensuring that the solution to this crisis reinforced her authority while avoiding any appearance of having deliberately sabotaged Elena. As Vivian prepared for what she knew would be the most important meeting of her reign as queen, she reflected on the irony that her victory over Elena might ultimately damage the very institution she had fought so hard to protect. But sometimes, she told herself, short-term damage was necessary to prevent long-term destruction. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would determine not just the personal futures of the people involved, but the fundamental direction of the monarchy itself. And everyone involved understood that whatever happened in that meeting room would echo through the institution for generations to come. The king's private office felt smaller than usual as the four key players in the royal family's crisis gathered around the antique conference table that had witnessed countless historical discussions. King Alexander sat at the head, his 68 years showing more prominently than usual in the deep lines around his eyes, and the slight tremor in his hands as he reviewed the newspaper that had forced this emergency meeting. Queen Vivian occupied her usual position to the king's right, impeccably dressed, and maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her through 15 years of royal challenges. Across from her, Princess Elena sat with quiet dignity, though those who knew her well could detect the tension in her rigid posture and carefully controlled breathing. Crown Prince Marcus completed the circle, positioned between his wife and stepmother in a seating arrangement that seemed to symbolize the impossible position he had occupied throughout this conflict. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before King Alexander finally set down the offending newspaper and looked around the table. "I find myself in the unprecedented position," he began slowly, "of having to address family conflicts that have become public spectacle. This is not just a personal failure on our part. It represents a fundamental threat to the institution we have sworn to protect." Elena felt the weight of his words, but she also detected something in the king's tone that suggested he understood the complexity of the situation they faced. Unlike the confrontations with Vivian, this felt like a conversation with someone who genuinely wanted to find a solution rather than simply assert dominance. "The newspaper article," Alexander continued, "contains information that could only have come from within this household. That means we have staff members who feel comfortable betraying the confidence of the royal family. This is perhaps the most serious breach of trust one have experienced in my 43 years as monarch." Vivian shifted slightly in her chair, and Elena wondered if the queen was beginning to understand that her campaign against Elena had created consequences that extended far beyond their personal conflict. When household staff began choosing sides and sharing private information with reporters, it threatened the basic security and privacy that made royal family life possible. "However," the king said, his gaze moving deliberately between Vivian and Elena, "the leak is merely a symptom of a deeper problem. We have allowed personal disagreements to create an environment where loyalty to the crown has been replaced by loyalty to individuals within the family." Elena appreciated that Alexander was addressing the conflict as a systemic issue rather than simply blaming one party or the other. But she also sensed that his analysis would likely lead to a solution that prioritized institutional stability over individual justice. "Your Majesty," Elena said carefully, "I want you to know that I have never encouraged staff members to take sides in this situation. I've tried consistently to maintain professional relationships while continuing the work I believe serves the crown effectively." "I'm sure you have," Alexander replied, though his tone was noncommittal. "But intention and result are often quite different things. The reality is that your rising profile has created divisions within our household that are now threatening the monarchy's stability." Elena felt a familiar stab of frustration at having her success characterized as the problem rather than the response to it. But she bit back her immediate response, recognizing that this meeting would likely determine her future role within the royal family. Queen Vivian finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had weathered numerous royal crises. "What matters now is not how we arrived at this situation, but how we resolve it in a way that protects the crown's dignity and effectiveness." Elena noticed that Vivian's phrasing carefully avoided any acknowledgement of her own role in creating the crisis. Instead, the queen was positioning herself as the voice of institutional wisdom focused on solutions rather than blame. "I agree completely," Alexander said, nodding toward his wife. which is why I've spent considerable time over the past few days consulting with constitutional experts and reviewing historical precedents for managing conflicts within the royal family. Marcus leaned forward slightly, recognizing that his father was about to present a formal proposal that would reshape their family dynamics. Elena braced herself for what she suspected would be a diplomatic request for her to step back from public duties. The solution I'm proposing, Alexander continued, involves restructuring our approach to royal duties in a way that eliminates overlap and competition while allowing both Queen Vivian and Princess Elena to serve effectively within clearly defined spheres of responsibility. Elena felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the king had found a way to preserve her meaningful work while addressing Vivian's concerns about authority and hierarchy. Queen Vivian will assume responsibility for all state functions, diplomatic events, and official ceremonies, Alexander explained. This includes state dinners, foreign visits, major institutional openings, and any events that involve formal representation of the crown in its governmental capacity. Elena's heart began to sink as she realized the direction this proposal was heading. All of the most prestigious and influential royal duties were being assigned to Vivian, leaving uncertain what meaningful role would remain for the future queen consort. Princess Elena, the king continued, will focus exclusively on charitable and social causes, particularly those involving children, education, and international development. These are areas where her natural talents and established relationships can continue to serve the public good without creating confusion about official royal positions. It was an elegant solution from an institutional perspective, but Elena immediately grasped its implications for her future effectiveness. She was being offered a role as a full-time charity patron while being excluded from the formal functions of monarchy that would allow her to develop the experience and relationships necessary to serve as queen. This restructuring, Alexander said, will eliminate any possibility of mixed messages or competing authorities while allowing both of you to focus on the areas where you can be most effective. Elena looked around the table and saw that Marcus was carefully avoiding her eyes. This solution had clearly been discussed and approved before the meeting, probably between father and son in one of their regular private consultations. She was being presented with a fait accompli disguised as a collaborative decision. Your Majesty, Elena said, choosing her words with extreme care, I appreciate the thought that has gone into this proposal. But I'm concerned about what this restructuring might mean for my preparation to serve as queen consort when Prince Marcus ascends to the throne. It was a reasonable question, and Elena could see that it made both Alexander and Marcus uncomfortable. They had crafted a solution to the immediate crisis without fully considering its long-term implications for the succession. That's still many years in the future, Alexander replied evasively. When that transition occurs, we can certainly revisit the distribution of responsibilities based on the circumstances at that time. Elena understood immediately that she was being offered no guarantees about her future role as queen. The restructuring would establish a precedent that could easily become permanent, leaving her permanently relegated to charitable work while the formal functions of the crown remained with others. I need some time to consider this proposal, Elena said, maintaining her diplomatic tone despite the turmoil she felt inside. Of course, Alexander replied. But I should mention that the Palace Communications Office is under tremendous pressure to respond to the newspaper story. We need a clear statement about the family's unity and the distribution of royal responsibilities. Ideally, we should announce the new structure within 48 hours. The timeline was clearly designed to pressure Elena into accepting the proposal without extensive consideration or negotiation. She was being asked to agree to a fundamental reshaping of her role and future with minimal time to explore alternatives or seek independent counsel. Queen Vivian spoke for the first time since the proposal had been presented. I think this arrangement recognizes everyone's strengths while ensuring that the crown speaks with a single, clear voice on matters of importance. Elena noticed that Vivian was careful not to show any satisfaction with the outcome, maintaining the appearance of someone who was simply supporting the king's wise decision rather than celebrating a personal victory. I understand the need for clarity, Elena replied. But I hope everyone understands that this restructuring represents a significant change from the role I've been developing over the past 7 years. I want to make sure that any decision I make serves the long-term interests of the monarchy, not just the immediate need to address media speculation. Marcus finally looked directly at Elena, and she could see both apology and appeal in his expression. He was asking her to accept this solution for the good of the family and the institution, even though they both knew it would fundamentally limit her future influence and effectiveness. "Elena," Marcus said quietly, "I know this isn't the arrangement any of us would have preferred. But, given the current situation, it may be the best way to preserve what matters most while allowing time for emotions to settle." Elena heard the subtext in Marcus's words. If she refused this proposal, there might be no acceptable role for her within the royal family at all. The alternative to accepting limited responsibilities might be complete exile from royal duties, which would effectively end her marriage and her connection to the work she cared about. "I'll need to review the specific details of what this restructuring would entail," Elena said finally, "including the organizations and initiatives that would be affected by the change." "Naturally," Alexander replied. "Sir Geoffrey has prepared a comprehensive transition plan that addresses all current commitments and future scheduling. You'll have that information by this evening." Elena stood, recognizing that the formal meeting had concluded and that any further discussion would need to happen privately. She had been given an ultimatum disguised as a reasonable proposal, and she had approximately 36 hours to decide whether to accept a dramatically diminished role or face the consequences of refusing to cooperate. "Thank you for your consideration of this difficult situation," Elena said, addressing the room formally. "I look forward to reviewing the details and providing my response." As Elena left the king's office, she felt the weight of understanding that her life as she had known it was about to change irrevocably. The choice before her was between accepting a role that would satisfy Vivian's need for dominance while preserving some opportunity to serve, or finding the courage to reject a solution that would effectively end her meaningful participation in royal life. Walking through the palace corridors that had become so familiar over the past 7 years, Elena reflected on the irony that her success in serving the monarchy had ultimately made her presence within it untenable. She had become too effective, too popular, and too independent for an institution that valued hierarchy above all else. That evening, Elena sat in her private study reviewing the transition plan that Sir Geoffrey had delivered as promised. The document was comprehensive and professionally prepared, outlining exactly which responsibilities she would retain and which would be transferred to Queen Vivian. As she read through the lists, Elena realized that she was being offered the opportunity to continue her work with children's literacy programs, international education initiatives, and several smaller charitable organizations. But she would lose her involvement with major state occasions, diplomatic functions, and the high-profile hospital and university patronages that had allowed her to make the most significant impact. The proposal was carefully crafted to appear generous, while actually removing her from any position where she might compete with or overshadow Queen Vivian. It would allow Elena to maintain her charitable work while ensuring that she could never again challenge the Queen's supremacy within the royal hierarchy. Margaret brought Elena tea and sat quietly while the princess worked through the implications of the decision before her. After nearly an hour of silence, Elena finally looked up from the documents. "Margaret, what would you do if you were in my position?" The older woman considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, in my experience, the people who make the greatest difference in the world are often those who find ways to work within imperfect systems rather than abandoning them entirely." It was wise counsel, but Elena wondered if accepting this compromise would ultimately serve anyone's interests except Queen Vivian's need for control. As she prepared to make the most important decision of her royal life, Elena realized that she was not just choosing her own future, but potentially setting a precedent that would define the monarchy's relationship with strong, effective women for generations to come. The following morning dawned gray and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over Ravenshollow Palace. Elena had spent most of the night walking through the private gardens, wrestling with the decision that would determine not only her own future, but potentially the entire trajectory of the monarchy's evolution into the modern era. As she prepared for what she knew would be her final meeting with King Alexander regarding the proposed restructuring, Elena found herself thinking about the children she had met through her literacy programs, the young women in developing countries who had benefited from the education initiatives she had championed, and the countless individuals whose lives had been touched by the work she would now be forced to abandon. Margaret helped Elena dress with particular care, understanding that this appearance would likely be scrutinized and remembered by everyone present. The choice of a navy blue suit, authoritative but not confrontational, reflected Elena's intention to maintain dignity while potentially disappointing powerful people who had expected her compliance. At precisely 10 o'clock, Elena knocked on the door of King Alexander's private office. She entered to find not only the king, but also Crown Prince Marcus and Queen Vivian, suggesting that they expected this meeting to serve as a formal acceptance ceremony for the proposed arrangement. "Good morning, Elena," King Alexander said, rising from behind his desk with what appeared to be relief at her punctuality. "I trust you've had adequate time to review the transition plan." "I have," Elena replied simply, taking the seat that had been prepared for her, but declining the cup of tea that would have suggested this was a casual, collegial discussion. "Excellent," Vivian said, speaking before the king could continue. "I think you'll find that the arrangement allows you to focus on the areas where you can be most effective while ensuring clarity about the family's overall priorities." Elena noted that Vivian was already speaking as though the decision had been made, but she had learned not to be surprised by the queen's tendency to assume outcomes that served her interests. "Actually," Elena said, looking directly at King Alexander, "I've decided that I cannot accept the restructuring as proposed." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner and the distant sound of traffic from the street beyond the palace gates. Marcus went very still in his chair, while Vivian's carefully controlled expression flickered with something that might have been satisfaction at having her predictions about Elena's intractability proven correct. King Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Elena with the careful attention of someone who had not expected this response despite having prepared for it. "I see," he said finally. "May I ask what specific concerns have led you to this conclusion?" Elena had rehearsed this moment throughout the sleepless night, knowing that her explanation would need to be both compelling and respectful if she hoped to maintain any possibility of finding an alternative solution. "Your Majesty," she began, "the proposed restructuring would effectively eliminate my ability to prepare for the responsibilities I will need to assume as Queen Consort when Prince Marcus ascends to the throne. More importantly, it would force me to abandon work that is making a genuine difference in people's lives simply to accommodate concerns about hierarchy and competition within our family." It was a direct challenge to the premise that institutional stability mattered more than effective service, and Elena could see that it made everyone in the room uncomfortable for different reasons. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "surely the work you care about could continue within the new structure. The charitable and educational initiatives would remain yours to develop and lead. But without the platform and authority necessary to make them truly effective," Elena replied, turning to face her husband directly. "The organizations I work with need access to government ministers, international partners, and major institutional resources. Those relationships depend on the perception that I speak with the authority of the crown, not just as someone who organizes charity events." It was a sophisticated argument that demonstrated Elena's deep understanding of how royal influence actually operated, and she could see that it resonated with King Alexander's own experience of monarchy as more than ceremonial display. "What alternative do you propose?" the king asked, though his tone suggested skepticism about any solution that might preserve Elena's current role. Elena took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would likely determine her future relationship with the royal family. "I believe the real problem is not that my work competes with Queen Vivian's authority, but that we've created an artificial scarcity around royal influence. There's no reason why the monarchy can't support multiple effective voices speaking on different aspects of public service, as long as those voices are coordinated and complementary rather than competitive." Queen Vivian's composure finally cracked slightly. "That's a very naive understanding of how monarchy functions. The crown's authority depends on unity and hierarchy. When multiple family members speak with equal weight on public issues, it undermines the fundamental principle of constitutional monarchy." Elena had anticipated this objection and was prepared for it. "With respect, Your Majesty, I don't think history supports that analysis. Some of the most effective periods in royal history have featured multiple family members taking leadership roles in different areas of public service. The key is coordination and mutual respect, not the suppression of effective voices." It was a bold argument, one that essentially suggested that Vivian's approach to royal authority was outdated and counterproductive. Elena was arguing for a more collaborative model of monarchy that would allow both women to contribute meaningfully while serving different constituencies and addressing different challenges. King Alexander studied Elena with renewed interest, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. "What specifically would such coordination look like in practice?" Elena felt a flicker of hope that her alternative approach might receive genuine consideration rather than immediate dismissal. Regular consultation between Queen Vivian and myself about scheduling, messaging, and priorities. Clear communication about which family member is taking the lead on specific issues or events. Public appearances that demonstrate unity and mutual support rather than competition. And, most importantly, a shared commitment to putting the monarchy's service mission above personal ego or status concerns. The last point was directed as much at Vivian as at the institutional challenges they faced, and Elena could see that the Queen understood the implicit criticism of her recent behavior. "It sounds very reasonable in theory," Vivian said coolly, "but it requires a level of trust and cooperation that may not be achievable given recent events." Elena recognized that Vivian was essentially arguing that their personal conflict had made collaborative leadership impossible, which would justify returning to the hierarchical arrangement that served the Queen's interests. "I'm willing to rebuild that trust," Elena said, looking directly at Vivian. "But it would require genuine commitment from all parties to find solutions that serve the monarchy rather than individual preferences for control or recognition." It was as close to a direct accusation as Elena dared make in front of the king, but she felt that the situation demanded honesty about what had actually created the crisis they faced. Marcus finally spoke, and Elena could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to find middle ground between his wife and stepmother. "Perhaps we could implement Elena's approach on a trial basis," he suggested. "Establish clear protocols for coordination and evaluation, with regular review sessions to ensure the arrangement is working effectively." Elena felt grateful for Marcus's support, even though she could see that he was still hoping to find a compromise that would satisfy everyone rather than a solution that might require one party to acknowledge they had been wrong. King Alexander was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the political and personal implications of different approaches to resolving the crisis. "The trial period is an interesting idea," he said finally. "But it would require both Queen Vivian and Princess Elena to publicly demonstrate the unity and cooperation that has been lacking in recent months." Elena understood that this was likely the best offer she would receive, but she also recognized the challenges it would create. A trial period would put enormous pressure on both women to make the arrangement work, while giving Vivian multiple opportunities to demonstrate that Elena's approach was unworkable. "I'm prepared to commit to such a trial," Elena said, "with the understanding that success would be measured by the effectiveness of our service to the public rather than the absence of media speculation about family dynamics." It was a crucial distinction, one that would prevent Vivian from sabotaging the arrangement by deliberately creating conflicts that would generate negative press coverage. Queen Vivian remained silent for nearly a full minute, and Elena could see that the Queen was calculating whether accepting this trial period served her interests better than insisting on the original restructuring proposal. "I suppose," Vivian said finally, "that demonstrating the unworkability of collaborative leadership might be more persuasive than simply imposing hierarchical solutions." Elena felt a chill at the implicit threat in Vivian's words, but she also recognized that this might be the only path forward that preserved any meaningful role for her within the royal family. "Very well," King Alexander said, clearly relieved to have found any solution that both women would accept. "We'll implement a 6-month trial period with formal evaluation sessions at regular intervals. Sir Geoffrey will work with both of you to establish protocols for coordination and communication." Elena knew that she had won a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent victory, but she also understood that 6 months would give her an opportunity to demonstrate that effective collaboration was possible despite Vivian's skepticism. As the meeting concluded, Elena realized that the real test would not be whether she could work effectively within the new arrangement, but whether she could do so while Vivian actively worked to prove that such cooperation was impossible. Walking back through the palace corridors that had become a battleground over the past months, Elena reflected on the irony that her fight to serve the monarchy effectively had required her to challenge the very people who controlled her ability to serve it all. The trial period would begin immediately, and Elena knew that every public appearance, every media interaction, and every internal discussion would be scrutinized for evidence of conflict or cooperation. She had successfully avoided immediate exile from meaningful royal duties, but she had also committed herself to working alongside someone who had made clear her intention to prove that Elena's vision for modern monarchy was fundamentally flawed. Over the following weeks, Elena and Vivian began the delicate work of implementing their collaborative arrangement under intense scrutiny from both the media and the palace staff. Early appearances together were carefully choreographed to demonstrate unity, but the underlying tensions remained palpable to anyone who understood royal dynamics. Elena found herself walking a precarious line between asserting her own vision for effective service and avoiding any appearance of challenging Vivian's authority. Every success in her charitable work had to be balanced against the risk that too much positive attention would be interpreted as evidence that the collaborative arrangement was actually a zero-sum competition. Meanwhile, Vivian approached the trial period with the calculating patience of someone who believed that time would prove her right about the impossibility of shared royal authority. She participated in joint appearances and coordination meetings with perfect correctness, while watching for any opportunity to demonstrate that Elena's approach created more problems than solutions. As the first month of the trial period concluded, both women understood that they were engaged in a complex chess game where the stakes were not just their personal futures, but the fundamental question of how the monarchy would adapt to changing public expectations in the 21st century. Elena had succeeded in preserving her meaningful work and her role within the royal family, but she had done so by entering into an arrangement with someone who remained committed to proving that her success was ultimately incompatible with institutional stability. The crown's shadow had not been lifted, but rather had taken on a new shape that would test both women's commitment to service above self-interest in ways that neither had fully anticipated when the conflict began.